Welcome to First Parish in Needham, Unitarian Universalist. We are proud to be certified as a welcoming congregation for our inclusivity of people of all gender identities, and as a green sanctuary for our commitment to addressing the climate crisis, and as a Level 2 sanctuary support congregation for our work in immigration reform. I'm Jeanette Anderson, and I serve on the Worship Committee, the Archives Committee, and recently I volunteered for 1.5 years at a sanctuary church in Newton. Because I'm on the Archives Committee, I like to give a little history lesson on History Sunday. Our first church was built in the years following our founding in 1711. Our second church was built in 1774 after a suspicious fire by people in Wellesley, it is said, who didn't want the church to be built in that certain place. And our third church, the one we have now, it was built in 1836. It was built near the intersection of Nahoyden Street and Central Avenue. It was moved in 1879 when the railroad came to Needham and the center of the town shifted. For our 100th anniversary, private contributions, not the town or the parish, bought the Paul Revere Bell. For our 200th anniversary, the wood panels were put up with the names of our former ministers. For our 300th anniversary, Parish Hall and the RE wing were renovated. Now, as you drive by the church with a visitor or a friend, you can act as a docent for our church. As you know, what's happening right now at the congregation is very different than usual because of the because of COVID-19. Our building is closed and we are gathering online only, at least through December. Though our building is closed, our community is open. Our First Parish community has become very creative about how we can stay in touch and renew our spirits without meeting in person. And we hope that you will plug into our Zoom gathering opportunities throughout the week. You can learn more about all that's happening at First Parish by doing a few things. First, uuneedham.org, or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube. If you're joining us for the first time this Sunday, you can sign up for our weekly email newsletter by going to our website, again, uuneedham.org, and clicking Get Involved Newsletter, or sending your requests by email to office@uuneedham.org. All are welcome to our Zoom social hour after this service. The link is provided in our weekly email newsletter. My personal fallback is always to email or call the office and talk to Susanna Whitman. We know this way of worshiping and gathering today is an adjustment for all of us. However, our sincere hope is that these online services and connection opportunities will help us keep the physical distance required during this pandemic without losing spiritual, emotional, and social closeness that we treasure in our faith community. If you're watching this service on YouTube live stream, please take a moment now to say hello in the chat box. Welcome again to everybody, and good morning.
As we light our chalice, symbol of our faith, we read words from Euro-American Unitarian Universalist minister, Reverend Audette Fulbright, in honor of service members and Veterans Day. We bow our heads in recognition of the great service and sacrifice some have been asked to make. Living through the horror that is war, facing death or physical harm as a specter looming around any corner, we say thank you and know it will never be enough. Help us to embrace those we have sent forth in our names into danger. Give us the strength of will to serve them as they have served us. May they never hunger. May they never thirst. May there always be meaningful work for their hands. May they receive healing care in abundance, and may we, the grateful heirs to a nation built on the idea of liberty, be faithful to pursuing that dream in our own lives and actions. Help us to be vigilant and never complacent. Let each of us take personally this charge for freedom and for peace.
In the Unitarian Universalist tradition, the covenant is a set of promises the membership of a congregation strives to honor with one another and out in the world. Though we cannot gather together in person during this time, we strive to live these promises every day. My family came to First Parish in 1970. We did not adopt this covenant until May of 2012. We had no covenant for the first 40 years that I was here. But now we do, and it is a beautiful, profound statement. Now, please say along with me, from home, the words of our parish covenant as shown on your screen. We gather as a loving community to encourage and comfort one another. We gather as a diverse community to support each other in our search for spiritual truth. We gather as a service community to live our beliefs through action and care for our world.
Hi everyone. This year, with our kids and our middle school youth, we have so far shared 2 Bible stories with the intentional lens of literacy for agnostics, atheists, and other liberals. The first story we shared was Noah's Ark. And then we acknowledged that this is often the first Bible story that kids hear. And yet often kids are just told the part about Noah saving the animals. And later they learn how scary the other details are. We wondered why people choose to tell the story to their very young kids. And then we wondered what happens when kids are told that this is a true story. With the 400th anniversary of the landing at Plymouth Rock, I thought we could apply the same Unitarian Universalist critical thinking to another famous old story, the legend of Squanto. I found this retelling of it on homemade-preschool.com. I will tell it exactly as they published it on their website with these cutouts they provided to animate the story, because it reminds me of the version I heard as a child. The Thanksgiving Story. Long ago in the year 1620, a group of people called the Pilgrims wanted to live somewhere they could be free to worship how they wanted to. They decided to sail across the ocean to a new land called America. They boarded the boat called the Mayflower and sailed across the ocean. They landed on the shore of America at Plymouth and had to go to work right away building homes and finding food. Winter was very hard on the Pilgrims and many died. Many more would have died, but an Indian named Squanto came to help them. He showed them how to plant corn and other plants. He showed them which plants they could use for medicine or food and which ones were poisonous. That year, the harvest was plentiful and they had enough food for winter. They decided to celebrate. Governor Bradford declared a day of prayer and thanksgiving. They invited the Indians and they all feasted, played games, and celebrated for 3 days. I wonder if you know that Squanto is not this person's real name, and that the full story includes slavery, a pandemic illness, and a lot of horrible actions done by the ancestors being celebrated with the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the Mayflower. I wonder why we, here in America, so frequently tell our children stories that contain such a minuscule amount of the true story. I wonder why only the parts that make our ancestors seem good and kind are included. I wonder why the parts that tell the hardships of the other people involved, including the hardships they suffered as a result of our ancestors, are almost never told. I hope that this time for all ages will remind you to use your Unitarian thinking mind and loving heart as you consider and evaluate the truth of any story you hear or read.
It is now time to share with one another our joys and concerns from the past week. These joys and concerns were submitted to me at internminister@uuneedham.org by the Thursday before the service at midnight. If you did not submit a candle but would like to share with the community this morning, you are invited to enter your message into the chat box. As our service is live streamed to YouTube, we cannot guarantee that your joys, concerns, sorrows, or milestones will stay within the First Parish community, but you are always welcome to reach out to Reverend Katie, myself, or the Pastoral Care Associate of the Week, whose name is included in your emailed order of service, for pastoral care or to share more privately. If you're missing hearing each other's voices during this beloved ritual, may this also serve as a reminder to reach out to one another after the service. May this beloved community be sustained by your creativity and care for each other during this time. Our first and only candle this morning is a candle of concern from Suzanne Pelton for Peter Nickel, who has brain cancer. The Pelton Nickel family attended First Parish when they lived in Needham. Aiden and Ella Suzanne were in religious exploration, and Isa was in the nursery. They now live in Concord and are active in the UU church there. Peter is the most loving, involved dad, husband, and son-in-law, and he also has incurable brain cancer. His family has come to see him, but because he is so sick, no one can enter their home. He has been able to see friends outside. The chemo and tumor make him so tired that he spends most of his time in bed. And it is so sad for his kids and wife. For all the joys and sorrows that we still hold in our hearts, and in acknowledging the prayers of our neighbors near and far, we light a final candle. May the peace in this sanctuary be felt too in each of your homes, as we remember that even though apart, we are still deeply connected. Amen. Let us join together now in prayer and meditation. Spirit of life and love, God of many names, we rejoice with all of you who come today in joy. We know that in times like this, we need joy and laughter if we are to continue the work that is ours to do. Our hearts are also with those who come today with a sorrow or a fear, or in tiredness or weariness. We direct our prayers toward a peaceful transition of power to the next presidential administration, so that resources aren't lost or compromised during this period of waiting, so that we might begin to be able to rebuild and come up with new, creative, necessary solutions to the many pandemics that our country currently faces. And we take a quiet moment together today to grieve the countrywide increase in the number of coronavirus infections, as 49 states this week have broken records for the number of daily new cases. And on Thursday, the U.S. surpassed more than 150,000 new cases in a single day for the first time. Even though we are 8 months into the pandemic, our hearts hurt over this recent spike in cases and hospitalizations, and all the individuals, families, and frontline staff who are affected. May we look to this loving community for resilience and hope when our own is in short supply. May we hold each other from a distance in the places that are the most tender this week. May we remember that even though physically distanced, we are still deeply connected. May it be so. And amen. And now please join us in singing from home our meditative hymn this morning, Blessed Spirit of My Life. The lyrics and music will appear on your screens.
Help me live with dignity.
This congregation has been supported by the volunteered time and treasure of its members and friends since its founding in 1711. In those 300 years, this community has weathered hard times, but we're still here. This is the time in our service when we, the modern stewards of this church, offer what we can to build and sustain the congregation and the world we envision. This Sunday, our collection will go in its entirety to the Nathan Hale School of Boston. I'll pass the mic to our member Jackie Shepard to share more about the Nathan Hale School, which is so close to her heart.
Good morning, friends. My name is Jackie Shepard, and I have been a member of this community for over 10 years. These past 4 years, I've been working at the Nathan Hale School in Roxbury, a low-income neighborhood. Now that Boston is in the red zone, schools are closed, and students must do all their learning online at home. I became very close to these students, learning a lot about their family lives. Their parents may be essential workers and not home during the day to help them. Therefore, the oldest child in the home is head of the household. A few weeks ago, my principal called me and asked if there was any way that I could help raise funds for kits that she is sending home each month. Kits will include supplies, activities, and books. Therefore, students will not be sitting home watching video games all winter. At this time, we don't know when schools will reopen. Ventilation is hard in old buildings. I know. I was never able to open a window. This morning's collection will address some of these racial inequities we as a community are committed to. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. To donate to today's offering, you can use one of 3 different methods. You can use our Text to Give program through the number 73256 with the exact wording of "You Need 'em" space plate or Pledge 21 space $, as you see on your screen. Or you can mail a check to First Parish at 23 Dedham Avenue, or you can make a donation through our website, uuneedem.org, and select Donate Now under the Giving box. Whichever way, remember to specify whether your donation is meant for the plate collection or for your annual pledge. Thank you for everything you are able to give to help support and sustain this congregation and the vital work of our community partners. Please take these next few moments to give what you can and know it will be gratefully received. Our reading this morning comes from modern Muskogee author and musician Joy Harjo, who is presently the Poet Laureate of the United States. This is her poem In Mystic, as in Mystic, Connecticut. My path is a cross of burning trees, lit by crows carrying fire in their beaks. I ask the guardians of these lands for permission to enter. I am a visitor to this history. No one remembers to ask anymore, they answer. What do I expect in this New England seaport town near the birthplace of democracy, where I am a ghost? Even a casino can't make an Indian real, or should I say native or savage or demon, and with what trade language? I am trading a backwards look for jeopardy. I agree with the ancient European maps. There are monsters beyond imagination that troll the waters. The Puritans' determined ships did fall off the edge of the world. I am happy to smell the sea, walk the narrow winding streets of shops and restaurants, and delight in the company of friends, trees, and small winds. I would rather not speak with history, but history came to me. It was dark before daybreak when the fire sparked. The men left on a hunt from the Pequot village here where I stand. The women and children left behind were set afire. I do not want to know this, but my gut knows the language of bloodshed. Over 600 were killed to establish a home for God's people, crowed the Puritan leaders in their Sunday sermons. And then history was gone in a betrayal of smoke. There is still burning, though we live in a democracy erected over the burial ground. This was given to me to speak. Every poem is an effort at ceremony. I asked for a way in. Here ends our reading. Each year, the Sunday closest to November 17th, we set aside as History Sunday, as we acknowledge the founding of our church and the town of Needham on that date in 1711. 2020 marks the 300th anniversary of the arrival of our first minister, Reverend Jonathan Townsend, and thus the formal signing of the church covenant and regular Puritan worship in our first meeting house. As we now know, with Townsend came his wife, Mary Sugars, and Homer, an enslaved African who was one of many African men, women, and children enslaved by members of our parish. Our reparations task force is pressing forward, despite the pandemic, in how to appropriately memorialize our slavery history and make reconciliation and reparation, if possible. November 2020 also marks the 400th anniversary of the landing of the Mayflower in Provincetown Harbor, about a month before those English pilgrims began their settlement of what is now Plymouth. And the history of indigenous peoples and European colonists, including specifically in the region, including and surrounding modern-day Needham, is what I want to focus on today. Though Needham didn't break off from the town of Dedham until 1711, and our church wasn't fully established until 1720, there's nearly a century of interactions between Europeans and local Native Americans prior to that made it possible for our church to be established here on land that our spiritual ancestors seized. I recognize that I am far from an expert on the complex history of colonization of this land, especially because that history has been hidden and distorted, just like it was for enslavement in our region. It must be noted that because of the genocide committed against Native American peoples in New England and the conflicting colonial records about who lived here and who had rights to this land, it is almost certainly the case that some of what I'm sharing is inaccurate. In researching this sermon, I even discovered that the land acknowledgement we've printed on our orders of service for the last couple of years is likely incorrect. While the Massachusetts people were definitely living in this region, there are contradictory reports on whether the Wampanoag people came this far north, and it turns out the Pawtucket almost certainly came this far south. It is difficult to reconstruct Indigenous history when there has been such violence against Indigenous bodies, communities, and culture. I am indebted to the work of Needham Town historian Gloria Grice, our own archives member Jeanette Anderson, and friend of both our church and the Natick Praying Indians, Ellen Fine, for their research and assistance, as well as the scholarship of Indigenous authors locally and nationally. Modern scholar, author, and activist Dr. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz writes, "It's important that we tell all people's history, but especially Native people, because it is the history of this country and it is what is lost. And we really should be mourning it, what was lost." There are two things. It's worse than you imagine what you thought was lost. And don't give up on Native people. They survived, they are survivors, and have survivor skills. They survived the worst genocide in human history, the greatest numbers over the greatest times. They know a lot that is going to be very important as we face some difficult times ahead. So let's try to tell the history. The short version is the Puritans and Pilgrims set out over the ocean looking for a sanctuary from the mainline Church of England. But in their search, they destroyed Indigenous communities' sanctuaries, though the native peoples of this region have shown great resilience in these 400 years. The New England Historical Society estimates that about 60,000 Native Americans lived in New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut at the beginning of the 17th century, and Maine had a robust population of Abenaki tribes. A century later, New England's indigenous population began to disappear. Some tribes were already extinct. Began to disappear is a soft way of putting it. Indigenous peoples of New England were exposed to disease, violence, land theft, demonization, and kidnapping into slavery. I turn our poet Joy Harjo's words around to the perspective of someone with my biological ancestry of 20th century Southern European immigrants and 19th century colonists in the Midwest, and of my spiritual ancestry, serving the former Puritan church here in Needham. I do not want to know about this, but my gut knows the language of bloodshed. Over 600 were killed to establish a home for God's people, crowed the Puritan leaders in their Sunday sermons, and this was literally true. Euro-American microbiologist Dr. Joshua Loomis wrote, to the colonists, smallpox was seen as a divine gift from God, a miraculous tool used against the non-Christian natives who had become a nuisance to them. This included Tisquantum's tribe, as we heard about in The Time for All Ages. Loomis quotes Puritan minister Increase Mather, who wrote this of the 1633 smallpox outbreak. The Indians began to be quarrelsome concerning the bounds of the land they had sold to the English. But God ended the controversy by sending the smallpox amongst the Indians at Saugus, who were before that time exceedingly numerous. Whole towns of them were swept away, in some of them not so much as one soul escaped the destruction. Loomis continues, Mather was essentially expressing what many in the United States had come to believe during this time, that God wanted civilized people to settle all the land north of Mexico and was willing to use smallpox to execute this plan. And when God was not moving fast enough for the colonists, however, there is some evidence that they may have taken matters into their own hands and purposefully tried to infect nearby native populations with smallpox. I should add that Increase Mather served as the minister of North Church and president of Harvard College. This is notable to us at First Parish because less than a century after Mather's death, Harvard College would become the training ground for nearly all New England Unitarian ministers, and North Church would become Second Church of Boston, a Unitarian congregation that Ralph Waldo Emerson briefly served, that carries on in modern times, merged with the Unitarian Universalist First Church of Boston. I once personally and accidentally sat in Increase's son, Cotton Mather's, chair in the parish house of First Church. Our spiritual ancestors were part of this history. This cruel philosophy that so dehumanized indigenous peoples was common Christian doctrine. Retired Euro-American UU minister Reverend Mike Johnson writes, "In 1452, a papal bull declared that the King of Portugal had the right to conquer any Muslim and pagan peoples and enslave them. A few years later, a second letter declared that all the Christian kings of Europe had the right to take lands and possessions of any non-Christian people and keep them in perpetuity. If the pagan inhabitants could be converted to the Christian faith, they might be spared, but otherwise they could be enslaved or killed." Johnson continues, "The doctrine of discovery became the legal basis for the discoveries of Columbus and others, and for the resulting attempts to conquer and colonize the Western Hemisphere, unleashing genocide on its peoples. It was also the legal basis for the slave trade. Its influence did not remain in that distant past. It's still a source of oppression to this day because it became the basis of U.S. Indian law. The doctrine of discovery is present in the attitude of Puritan and Pilgrim colonists and thus in the history of Needham. And indeed, as Johnson wrote, the doctrine has still not been overturned legally in the United States." Gloria Grice wrote for the Needham History Center that artifacts excavated in Needham show the presence of indigenous communities going back 8,000 years before colonists arrived. The land here that we now know as Needham was first visited by Europeans shortly after that smallpox epidemic of 1633. The town of Contentment was first established by colonial authorities in 1635, with settlers arriving the following summer. Soon, the large town would be known as Dedham. The local Massachusetts called the land Tiat, which means land surrounded by water, and indeed, Old Dedham, which contained 21 modern Massachusetts towns, including Needham, Wellesley, Dover, and Natick, was surrounded by the Charles River, or as the Massachusetts called it, Quenobequin, meaning meandering or bending river. Colonial histories note that 100 Massachusetts were living in this region, including a settlement near Needham's present-day Ridge Hill Reservation. Our own town's history with indigenous peoples is murky and I would say suspect, but I'll share with you what we could find. As was part of the doctrine of discovery behavior, Puritan missionary Reverend John Eliot, for whom our Needham Eliot Elementary School is named, began his attempts to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity in the 1630s. A Montucket man enslaved after the Pequot War, Kakano, was one of the Native Americans who helped John Eliot learn the local language, which allowed for more effective preaching and the publication of the Eliot Algonquin Bible in the 1660s, the first Bible printed in British North America. Eliot promoted the idea of bringing indigenous converts together in praying Indian towns. Eliot and a group of Christian converts established the first praying Indian town in 1651 in what was then Dedham and is now Natick, though there were legal battles against the establishment of this indigenous community for nearly another 15 years. When Needham was founded in 1711, 1,600 acres were also set aside as Indian land for Christian Native Americans and their church. Though soon after Natick was established as a separate town in 1781, these commitments of land and sovereignty to the praying Indians were revoked, and their church and their community was dissolved. During Metacom's rebellion, popularly known as King Philip's War, in 1675, the General Court of Massachusetts Bay Colony removed all praying Indians to Boston Harbor's Deer Island. You may remember that the doctrine of discovery put the rights of Christians over non-Christians, and yet the Christian indigenous peoples of our town were not protected. Though over 1,000 Native Americans were taken to Deer Island, fewer than 200 survived the winter and lack of food supplies. When our town's survivors returned to Natick, they found their homes and land had been looted or destroyed. Just as after the Pequot War, many indigenous peoples were kidnapped and sold into slavery after Metacom's rebellion. Despite objections from local indigenous organizations, a wastewater treatment plant was built on Deer Island in the 1990s. There is a close tie between Needham, the praying Indians of Natick, and the tragedy of Deer Island. In the mythos of Needham's founding is an indigenous man often called Chief Nahoyden. April 13th is Nahoyden Day in Needham, and it's a Needham Street and a Newton Park and Street and a golf course in Wellesley. These are all named after him. As Gloria Grice has written, Nahoyden was not a chief, but his family joined John Eliot's praying Indian village in Ponkapog, what is now Canton. Nahoyden preached and led a school there and was recruited to help quell tensions between the English colonists and Metacom prior to the start of the war. Nahoyden was not sent to Deer Island with the rest of the praying Indians because his translation services were considered essential. But he and John Eliot did make several journeys to the island to bring much needed but still inadequate supplies. After the war, the British government wished to validate land claims with deeds attesting to their purchase. As Gloria Grice wrote, Nahoyden acted as the negotiator for the deeds for Hingham, Braintree, Walpole, and Dorchester, as well as Dedham. The Dedham deed, 14th of April, 1680, records his sale to Dedham of the land that had belonged to his father, north of the Charles River, as far as the Upper Falls, the land that would become Dedham North Parish and finally Needham and Wellesley. Personally, I find all of that somewhat suspicious, and I am curious how free Nahoyden felt as a negotiator in this situation between the triumphant colonists and the defeated indigenous leaders. Needham's town seal shows this event with stereotypical imagery of Nahoyden handing a scroll, the deed, to two English colonists. Neither the town seal nor Nahoyden golf course nor the most popular tellings of Nahoyden's story include the tragedy of Deer Island. And of course, colonist Needhamites fought indigenous peoples in the Pequot, King Philip's, and later French and Indian Wars. If it had not been for all this violence and theft by our Puritan spiritual ancestors, our church could not have been fully established 300 years ago in 1720. It is part of our history. For the 1911 200th anniversary of Needham, our congregation's historian, who also served as a town official, George Kuhn Clark, published a history of the town. He notes in there that there were a few indigenous people still present in Needham up until 1776, including those who served the colonies in the Revolutionary War. But then the European settler narrative of local Native Americans drops off. But we know that the indigenous people of New England have survived and continue to fight for their rights today. There are a few prominent indigenous organizing groups in Massachusetts, like the North American Indian Center of Boston and the Massachusetts Center for Native American Awareness. There is still a small community of Natick praying Indians that have recently reestablished their worship at the Eliot Church of South Natick, which was built on the site where their ancestors worshiped at the Praying Indian Meeting House. The Mashpee Wampanoag are presently advocating for the reaffirmation of their tribal land trust, which the current federal administration revoked near the start of the pandemic. It is my understanding that nearly all our members and friends at First Parish are non-native and come from early colonist or more recent immigrant backgrounds. There is soul work to be done by non-native residents of the Americas to uproot colonial racism and anti-indigenous theology. Modern Osage professor and Lutheran pastor Dr. Tink Tinker said at a Unitarian Universalist roundtable on the soul work of anti-racism that it takes people roughly as long to recover from an addiction as they spent being addicted. This same dynamic of healing applies at the corporate systemic level as well. The addiction I am talking about has been going on for over 500 years in this hemisphere. It will take the energies of our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, at least 7 generations, to bring things back into harmony and balance. Take a deep breath. We are in this for the long haul. The churches need to create a new kind of liberation theology that moves beyond what our Latin American, African, and Asian siblings developed in the last third of the last century. We need to dream of a liberation theology that makes a preferential option for the poor and the oppressed, but also talks about how each of us can become free. Indian peoples will never be free on this continent until white Americans are also free. Our national denomination, the Unitarian Universalist Association, took this advice seriously and has attempted to begin the recovery process. Because of our spiritual ties to the Puritans, the UUA put forward resolutions regarding Indigenous rights in 2012 and 2016. At a formal ceremony at General Assembly, our national gathering, annual gathering, in Salt Lake City in 2006, with the Ute tribe, the denomination apologized for our involvement in the late 1800s serving as Protestant managers of the Ute people under the federal government. As I said in the beginning, there's much we still don't know and may never know about our particular churches and towns' historic relationship with Indigenous peoples. I don't have an answer for how we repair and restore the land stolen and treaties broken and ancestors tortured and killed by immigrant Americans and the United States government. But I know we can begin by carefully examining the colonialist history many of us have been taught our whole lives. Understanding our history is a starting point for our transformation into an anti-racist faith community in solidarity and relationship with modern Indigenous peoples whose ancestors were displaced and murdered by our spiritual ancestors. For now, I'll close with a detailed land acknowledgement. As I mentioned before, in our orders of service for Sunday morning, we have printed a land acknowledgement, now updated to reflect more accurate information. It says, "We remember that we are gathered today on the occupied territory of the Massachusetts and Pawtucket peoples who have stewarded this land for generations." What I share with you now follows, as best I could, land acknowledgement guidelines recommended by Indigenous educators and scholars Dr. Natalie Martinez and Dr. Jean Mendoza at the virtual UUA General Assembly this June. Today, in this anniversary year, both of the Mayflower landing and the formal opening of this church I serve, I acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, and occupied territory of the Massachusetts and Pawtucket on which I live and work. I grew up as the grandchild of immigrants in this nation that denies the history of genocide against its Indigenous peoples. I was not taught the ancient names and full history of the land on which I grew up, and it is challenging to correct that ignorance with so much history lost or buried. I acknowledge the painful history of genocide and removal from this land of the Pawtucket and the Massachusetts, and honor that these communities mindfully stewarded this land for thousands of years and continue to fight for its health and sustainability today. I will continue to do my best to serve in solidarity in the struggle against systems of oppression that have dispossessed Indigenous people of their lands and denied their rights to self-determination here and around the world. It is part of my responsibility as a person with settler privilege, and especially as minister of a former Puritan congregation, to share accurate information about Indigenous history, support local Indigenous organizing and leadership, and decolonize my broader community to the best of my abilities. This includes educating myself by reading scholarship from Native scholars, advocating for the Indigenous legislative agenda in Massachusetts that seeks to establish Indigenous Peoples Day, change the Massachusetts state flag, improve educational outcomes for Indigenous youth, criminalize for-profit sale of Indigenous cultural objects, and ban stereotypical mascots. And I can support global Indigenous movements for autonomy, reparations, and environmental stewardship. May this be a beginning of healing and repair. As Tink Tinker said, it will take the energies of our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren at least 7 generations to bring things back into harmony and balance. Take a deep breath. We are in this for the long haul. May our faith community sustain us in the hard work of uncovering hidden truths, reformulating our understanding of history, and building strong relationships of service and solidarity with our neighbors. Blessed be, and amen.
Hymn number 1, May Nothing Evil Cross This Door, has words from a poem by 20th century Jewish American U.S. Poet Laureate Louis Untermeyer, set to a tune from 20th century Irish Methodist businessman and composer Robert Quayle. Please join us now in singing from home hymn number 1, May Nothing Evil Cross This Door.
As we close our worship today, you are all invited to stay with us for Zoom social hour. Please remember to keep a careful eye out for emails from First Parish and follow us on social media so you can keep up with opportunities for connection for all ages throughout the week during these times of physical isolation. Again, you can sign up for our weekly email by clicking on Subscribe to Newsletter on our website, uuneedham.org. Remember, if you fall ill or need any pastoral support, to reach out to our ministers, Reverend Katie Scudera and Jenna Crawford, and the pastoral care team and caring crew through phone or email. We also encourage all of you to strongly check in with your friends and all First Parish members that you know, and to double check your own contact information in our online Realm directory. Please email our office administrator, Susanna Whitman, if you have any questions about using our online directory. We always extinguish our chalice with words promising to carry its flame in our hearts until we are together again, no matter how long it is, until we are together again. As we extinguish our chalice today, please join me from home in saying those words written by Unitarian Universalist minister, Reverend Elizabeth Selly-Jones. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, nor the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
As we close our worship today, take these words adapted from local Black Unitarian Universalist minister Reverend Daniel Gregor with you today as a benediction. Spirit of life, God of roots and branches, we are learning how we came to this place, and here we are. Help us to be wise as well as compassionate, persevering, and courageous in this moment, so that we might be worthy of the challenges that lay before us, and be grateful for the communities and relationships we are called to restore. Our service begins when our service ends. Blessed be, and amen.
In the quiet, misty morning, when the moon has gone to bed, when the sparrows stop their singing, and the sky is clear and red, when the summer ceased its gleaming, when the corn is past its prime, when adventure's lost its meaning, I'll be homeward bound in time. Bind me not to the pasture, chain me not to the plow, set me free to find my calling, and I'll return to you somehow. If you find it's me you're missing,